There are moments in a nation's life that do not arrive with explosions or breaking news banners. They arrive quietly, in a hall filled with uniforms, medals, and measured silence. No shouting crowds, no flashing cameras, just a country holding its breath. This morning in Burkina Faso, such a moment unfolded. A senior military officer stepped forward to receive a new rank General of Division. But this was not a routine promotion. The insignia was placed on his shoulders personally by the head of state, the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, Ibrahim Traoré. In military culture, that gesture carries a meaning deeper than ceremony. It is trust. It is responsibility. And above all, it is a reminder that no rank is a reward, it is a burden. The officer did not celebrate himself. Instead, he spoke of sacrifice, not his own, but the sacrifice of a young president who, in his words, has given up his youth to carry a nation at war. He spoke of 3 years of hard fighting, of territories reclaimed, of families returning to villages they once fled, of a struggle that is not only fought on battlefields, but in schools, farms, hospitals, and the very idea of what the nation stands for. What made this moment striking was not bravado. It was humility. A senior commander, nearly 60 years old, openly acknowledging that the heaviest weight rests on the shoulders of someone far younger. And with that acknowledgement came a call not to applause, but to duty, to do more, to stand closer, to ensure that such sacrifice is not wasted but remembered by history as a turning point. For viewers here in the United States, especially those who have lived through wars, Cold War tensions, and decades of political change, this raises uncomfortable but necessary questions. What does real leadership look like when a country is fighting for survival? Can sacrifice still exist in modern politics, or has it been replaced by slogans and sound bites? And when a young leader takes on an old war, should the world judge him by headlines or by outcomes? This is not just a story about Burkina Faso. It is a story about responsibility, memory, and the price nations ask a few to pay on behalf of many. Please share if you believe real leadership is measured by sacrifice, not popularity. Subscribe if you believe the truth about Africa deserves more than passing headlines. The ceremony itself was simple, but its meaning was anything but. In a quiet military setting in Burkina Faso, a senior officer stood before his peers to receive the rank of General of Division. There were no victory speeches, no dramatic flourishes. What mattered was who performed the act and how it was done. The insignia was placed personally by the head of state and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, Ibrahim Traoré. In most armies around the world, promotions are delegated, processed through layers of command. When a president steps forward himself, it signals something deliberate. This was not protocol, it was intent. The newly promoted general made that clear from his first words. He did not frame the moment as a personal achievement. Instead, he described it as two things at once, a sign of trust and a warning. Trust, because the president had chosen him for a mission that clearly remains unfinished. A warning, because rank in wartime is not a destination, it is an obligation to perform better than before. What makes this moment particularly significant is the background of the man speaking. He is not a newcomer elevated for optics. He has already served as Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces. He has already held the post of Minister of Defense. He understands the battlefield, the bureaucracy, and the weight of command. When such a figure publicly emphasizes responsibility over celebration, it tells us something about the internal culture being reinforced. The general reminded those present that the past 3 years have not been abstract. Territory has been retaken. Entire localities that were once abandoned due to insecurity have been reclaimed. Families, farmers, elders, children have returned to villages they were forced to flee. These are not symbolic victories. They are practical outcomes measured in roads, reopened fields, replanted, and homes reoccupied. But the speech carefully avoided portraying the struggle as purely military. This was one of its most important elements. The general stressed that the president's fight is not limited to the battlefield. Security operations, he said, are only one front. Development, governance, and national reconstruction are just as critical. A country cannot be held together by weapons alone. This framing matters especially for audiences accustomed to seeing conflict through narrow lenses. The message here was clear. Stability is not just about defeating armed threats. It is about restoring the conditions that allow ordinary life to resume. Schools functioning, markets operating, communities trusting that tomorrow will not collapse into chaos. The general then placed the president at the center of this effort, not as a distant commander, but as what he called the first soldier of the struggle. His words were direct. He stated openly that much of what has been accomplished has required the personal involvement, energy, and decision-making of the president himself. This was not praise for its own sake. It was an explanation of why responsibility must be shared more broadly. By describing the promotion as both an honor and a reminder, the general extended the message beyond himself. Everyone listening, officers, administrators, civil servants, was being addressed. The implication was unmistakable. If the head of state is willing to carry this burden at a young age, then those with experience have no excuse to stand back. There was no mention of foreign governments, no references to international partners or critics. The speech was inward-facing, disciplined, and focused on internal accountability. That choice is telling. It suggests a leadership culture attempting to consolidate trust and cohesion before seeking external validation. In the end, the event was less about rank and more about alignment. A president signaling confidence, a general acknowledging duty, and a nation still under strain being reminded that progress is measured not by titles, but by results that ordinary people can see and feel. The emotional center of the speech did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic pauses. It emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, through a simple comparison, one that cut deeper than any slogan. The general spoke of age. He reminded those listening that many of the senior officers present were approaching 60 years old. Men who had lived full careers, decades of service, and the gradual comfort that often comes with seniority. Then, he turned the focus back to the president, still young, still early in life, and described what he called the real cost of leadership, the sacrifice of youth itself. This was the moment when the room shifted. The statement was not framed as flattery, it was framed as accountability. Youth, the general implied, is not something that can be repaid later. When it is spent in service of a nation at war, it is gone forever. And that reality, once spoken aloud by an elder, carries moral weight. For audiences in Burkina Faso, this message resonated deeply. In many African societies, age is associated with wisdom, authority, and rest earned through long service. For a younger leader to assume the heaviest burden while elders acknowledge it publicly creates a powerful inversion of expectation. It challenges everyone listening to reconsider their own role. The general's response to this realization was not sentimental. It was direct. He called on all those present to double their efforts. Not tomorrow, not eventually, now. His words made clear that admiration alone is meaningless if it does not translate into action. Support, he emphasized, must be practical, visible, and relentless. This is where the speech reached its true climax. The promotion, the rank, the ceremony, all of it became secondary to a single idea: shared responsibility. The general framed the president's sacrifice as a test for everyone else. If a young head of state is willing to carry the pressure of national survival, then those with experience, authority, and institutional power must do more than observe. They must close ranks and carry their share. There was also a subtle emotional shift in how the future was described. The general spoke not only of the present struggle, but of how history would remember this period. He spoke of posterity, of how future generations would look back and ask whether this sacrifice produced results that were tangible and lasting. This forward-looking perspective is critical. It reframed the conflict as something larger than the current moment. Villages reclaimed today matter not only because people can return home, but because they represent proof that sacrifice leads somewhere. That progress is possible, that a nation can move forward even under strain. The response implied by the speech was not applause, but alignment. Officers listening were being asked to internalize a simple truth: loyalty is not expressed through words, but through sustained effort. Through discipline, through results that justify the cost being paid at the top. Notably, the speech did not invite sympathy for the president. It did not ask for patience or indulgence. Instead, it asked for performance. The general's tone made clear that sacrifice only has meaning if it produces change, that ordinary people can feel security in their villages, stability in their lives, and confidence in the future. This is where the emotional impact extends beyond the room. For older viewers in the United States, many of whom remember leaders shaped by war crisis and generational duty, this moment may feel familiar. It echoes a time when leadership was often discussed in terms of service rather than branding. when age and experience were expected to support, not overshadow those carrying frontline responsibility. The climax of this speech was not a dramatic declaration, it was a quiet challenge, one that asked every listener directly or indirectly a difficult question. When history looks back on this moment, will it see spectators or participants? Once the emotion of the moment settled, the speech moved into its most consequential territory, what this leadership model means for civilians, institutions, and the political direction of Burkina Faso itself. The general made it clear that the struggle underway is not defined only by military outcomes. Reclaimed territory matters, yes, but only because people can live there again. The return of families to their villages is not a footnote. It is the measure by which success is judged. When civilians feel safe enough to come home, plant crops, reopen markets, and send children back to school, the nation begins to heal. This is where the political implications become unavoidable. A government that asks its people to endure insecurity must also show visible progress in daily life. The speech acknowledged this indirectly but firmly. By emphasizing that the president's fight extends beyond the battlefield, the general outlined a political contract: security operations must translate into development, and development must reinforce security. At the center of this contract stands Ibrahim Traoré. The general described him not as a distant decision-maker, but as the first soldier of a broader national effort. This framing carries political weight. It places responsibility squarely at the top, but it also removes excuses from everyone else. If the head of state is personally engaged on every front: security, governance, reconstruction, then ministries, military units, and civil administrations cannot operate on autopilot. Performance becomes the expectation, not loyalty displays. For civilians, this has tangible consequences. It raises expectations that promises will be matched by outcomes, that reclaimed areas will not be abandoned again, that development will follow security, not lag behind it indefinitely. The speech implicitly acknowledged a truth many citizens already understand: patience is not infinite, especially after years of displacement and loss. Politically, the tone of the speech reinforced a model of governance centered on discipline and collective responsibility rather than ideological debate. There was no talk of parties' elections or external approval. Instead, the focus remained on national survival and cohesion. This signals a political environment where legitimacy is being constructed through action rather than procedure. For some observers, this approach may appear austere, but for populations living under constant threat, the priority is often less about rhetoric and more about whether tomorrow will be safer than today. The general's message recognized this reality. He did not promise perfection. He promised effort and demanded it from others. Another important consequence lies in how authority is exercised. By publicly framing his promotion as a reminder rather than a reward, the general reinforced a culture where rank does not shield one from scrutiny. This matters politically because it sets expectations across institutions. Authority is conditional. It must be justified continuously through results. This culture has ripple effects. It pressures senior officials to remain present, responsive, and accountable. It also shapes how younger officers and civil servants understand their future roles, not as pathways to comfort, but as obligations tied to national outcomes. The speech also looked ahead, emphasizing how history would judge this period. That perspective transforms short-term decisions into long-term responsibilities. It suggests that leaders are acting with an awareness that their actions will be measured not only by current supporters, but by future generations who will ask whether the sacrifices made produced lasting stability. In that sense, the civilian and political consequences converge on a single point: trust. Trust that security gains will endure, trust that leadership sacrifices are meaningful, and trust that institutions will rise to meet the moment rather than retreat behind titles. Whether that trust holds will depend not on speeches, but on what ordinary citizens see in their daily lives in the months and years ahead. What makes this moment in Burkina Faso particularly striking to international audiences is not what was said, but what was deliberately left unsaid. There were no references to global powers, no appeals to allies, no criticisms of foreign governments or international institutions. The speech did not seek validation from Washington, Paris, Brussels, or the United Nations. Instead, it spoke inward to soldiers, civil servants, and citizens about responsibility, sacrifice, and results. For American viewers, especially those over 60 who have lived through Vietnam, the Cold War, and the long aftermath of September 11th, this inward focus may feel unfamiliar. In recent decades, political speeches in many parts of the world have become outward-facing, crafted for international headlines, donor conferences, and diplomatic reactions. This speech was the opposite. It assumed that legitimacy must first be earned at home. From a U.S. perspective, this raises an important comparison. In Washington, leadership is often evaluated through polling numbers, media cycles, and electoral timelines. Here, leadership is framed through endurance and consequence. The question is not how a leader is perceived abroad, but whether people can safely return to their villages, reopen markets, and rebuild their lives. This difference matters. The general's words suggested a model of leadership in which authority flows from visible sacrifice and measurable outcomes, rather than institutional prestige. By emphasizing that the head of state Ibrahim Traoré has given up his youth to carry the burden of a nation at war, the speech placed moral responsibility at the center of governance. That framing resonates with older American audiences who remember a time when public service was often discussed in similar terms. Globally, the message also stands out because it resists the language of alignment. There was no mention of choosing sides in a multipolar world, no signaling toward east or west. The focus remained strictly national. This suggests a leadership posture that prioritizes internal cohesion before external partnerships, a sequence that many countries talk about but few practice consistently. For international observers, especially in Europe and North America, this inward posture can be uncomfortable. It limits leverage. It reduces the effectiveness of external pressure based on narratives rather than facts on the ground. When a government measures its legitimacy by domestic outcomes instead of international approval, it changes the balance of influence. At the same time, the speech implicitly invited scrutiny of a different kind. By grounding legitimacy in results, it opened the door to judgment based on lived reality. Are communities safer? Are displaced families returning home permanently? Are development efforts following security gains? These are questions that matter everywhere, not just in Africa. For American audiences, the deeper question may be this: would such a speech even be possible in today's political climate back home? A senior official publicly emphasizing sacrifice over success, duty over recognition, and accountability over ambition. This moment challenges assumptions not only about African leadership, but about modern leadership more broadly. It asks whether governance should be judged by intent or by impact, by words or by outcomes. The world is watching Burkina Faso, whether quietly or openly. But the message from this ceremony was clear: the primary audience is not foreign capitals. It is history itself. As the ceremony concluded and the hall returned to silence, one message lingered long after the uniforms dispersed. This was not a declaration of victory. It was a warning, quiet, firm, and unmistakable. The general's final words framed the struggle as irreversible. Not because success is guaranteed, but because retreat is no longer an option. When a nation commits its youth, its elders, and its institutions to survival, there is no safe exit ramp. The cost has already been paid. What remains is the obligation to ensure that cost produces something lasting. For Burkina Faso, that obligation now extends far beyond the military. It reaches into villages being rebuilt, communities learning to trust again, and institutions being tested under pressure. The speech made clear that sacrifice alone is not enough. Sacrifice must lead to visible, undeniable change, or it risks becoming a tragic footnote rather than a turning point. This is where the warning becomes universal. History is filled with moments when leaders asked their people to endure hardship in the name of a better future. Some of those moments produced renewal. Others produced disappointment. The difference was rarely intention. It was execution. Follow-through, the willingness of institutions to match the courage of individuals. By placing the burden of youth and responsibility at the center of his message, the general forced a reckoning. If a young head of state like Ibrahim Traoré is prepared to carry the weight of national survival, then every layer beneath him must be prepared to deliver results worthy of that sacrifice. There is no room left for complacency disguised as loyalty. For international audiences, especially in the United States, this moment offers a chance to pause and reflect. Not to romanticize struggle, not to ignore complexities, but to recognize that leadership at its core is still about responsibility, about answering to the people who live with the consequences long after speeches fade. The path ahead is narrow. Security gains must hold. Development must follow. Trust must be rebuilt patiently, village by village, institution by institution. None of this happens quickly, and none of it happens automatically. The speech did not promise certainty. It promised commitment. And it reminded everyone listening that history will not judge intentions, it will judge outcomes. So the question now belongs not only to Burkina Faso, but to all of us watching from afar. Will this level of sacrifice translate into lasting stability? Will institutions rise to meet the standards set by their leaders? And when the dust finally settles, will this moment be remembered as the beginning of renewal or a test that was not fully met? Please share if you believe. Real leadership demands sacrifice, accountability, and results, not slogans. Subscribe if you believe Africa's future deserves to be understood with depth, patience, and honesty beyond the headlines.